In the year 1889, in the quiet stretches of rural Georgia, where farmland rolled endlessly beneath the southern sun and communities lived by tradition, one family carried a burden they dared not speak of. The Johnsons were known as hardworking farmers, people of modest means who kept mostly to themselves. But behind the walls of their wooden farmhouse, beneath the creaking floorboards, a secret festered in silence. When Mrs. Johnson gave birth to twins, the town midwife gasped. The babies were not like the others she had delivered in her long years of service. Their skin was pale as ivory, their hair as white as snow, and their eyes reflected the lantern light in an unusual shimmer. The midwife whispered the word under her breath, Albino. In a time when superstition ruled the countryside and difference was met with fear, such a birth was seen as an omen. Mr. Johnson, a stern man already weighed down by poverty, felt shame coil in his chest. "What will the neighbors say?" he asked his wife that night, his voice sharp with anxiety. She wept quietly, torn between the natural love of a mother and the pressure of a society that would judge them harshly. They both knew the whispers that would follow if the children were seen. Curses, failed harvests, God's punishment. It was in this fog of fear that the fateful decision was made. Instead of showing their children proudly to the world, they carried them down into the cellar. What began as a temporary hiding place until the gossip died down became their prison for decades. The cellar was nothing more than a stone chamber beneath the farmhouse, damp, cold, and lit only by the flicker of lanterns. The Johnsons justified their cruelty with the thought that they were protecting the children from ridicule, yet in truth, they were protecting themselves from shame. Day after day, they lowered scraps of food through the trapdoor, avoiding the sight of the twins' pale faces. The children grew without sunlight, without laughter of playmates, without the warmth of neighbors who might have offered kindness. Their world became the smell of earth, the sound of creaking boards above, and the faint light of a lantern. As years passed, they learned to whisper so as not to anger their father, to huddle together for warmth, and to find comfort only in each other's presence. This was the Johnson family's dark secret, two children hidden away like shadows, not because they had done wrong, but because their appearance challenged the ignorance of the time. But secrets weigh heavy on the soul. Mr. Johnson grew harsh and reclusive, snapping at neighbors who asked too many questions. Mrs. Johnson, though torn by guilt, convinced herself she was doing what was necessary. Every creak of the floorboards reminded her of the children below, every prayer at night a plea for forgiveness. But fear is a powerful jailer, and guilt does not always lead to action. Meanwhile, outside the Johnson farm, life in Georgia moved on. The community celebrated harvest festivals, built schools, and sang hymns on Sundays. Yet, beneath one farmhouse, two lives were being wasted in darkness, and though the town may not have known the full truth, some suspected. The children were never seen, and whispers floated through the marketplace. But suspicion without courage is as dangerous as silence. No one confronted the Johnsons directly, and so the cellar remained locked. The story of the Johnsons is not merely about cruelty. It is about the power of fear and the destruction that comes when people care more about reputation than humanity. Fear turned loving parents into jailers. Fear robbed two children of their right to sunlight, laughter, and growth. And fear turned neighbors into bystanders, unwilling to seek the truth. Yet within this darkness a lesson shines. The twins themselves, though deprived of the world above, never stopped hoping. They made games out of shadows cast on the walls. They traced letters into the dirt. They whispered dreams of fields they had never seen. Even in captivity, the human spirit found ways to resist. The Johnson family's dark secret was eventually revealed, but the years of hiding cannot be erased. What we can take from their tragedy is a mirror for our own lives. How often do we hide what is different? How often do we allow fear of judgment to dictate our actions? And how often do we choose silence instead of courage when we sense something is wrong? The Johnson cellar is more than a physical place, it is a symbol. It represents the prisons we build when we let prejudice, ignorance, and fear rule our hearts. The story compels us to ask, what secrets are we still keeping? Whose light are we still locking away? In every community, in every time, there are those who are different. By skin, ability, belief, or circumstance, they are often met with suspicion or rejection, but the lesson of the Johnson twins is clear: difference is not a curse. It is a call for compassion, for understanding, for courage. The Johnsons' dark secret should not only horrify us, it should awaken us. It reminds us that silence in the face of injustice is itself a form of cruelty. That the cost of protecting appearances can be measured in lost lives and stolen years, and that every child, no matter how they look, deserves the warmth of sunlight and the dignity of love. As we reflect on the Johnson family's choice, let us remember this: the greatest prisons are not built from stone and wood, but from fear and ignorance. And the key to breaking them open lies in courage, compassion, and truth. The story of a family's dark secret in Georgia is not just history, it is a warning, but it is also a call to action, a call to ensure that no child, no person, is ever again hidden away because they are different. The cellar was more than a room, it was a world of stone walls, damp earth, and flickering lantern light. For the Johnson twins, born with skin like ivory and hair as white as winter snow, this dark chamber beneath their family's farmhouse in Georgia became the only world they knew. What should have been a place for storing potatoes and preserving jars of jam turned into their childhood, their schoolroom, their playground, and their prison. In the beginning, as infants, they did not understand. They cried for warmth, and their mother soothed them in whispers, pressing food into their small mouths before retreating quickly up the creaking steps. They were too young to sense the shame in her eyes or the heaviness in their father's silence. All they knew was the sound of the trapdoor closing and the emptiness that followed. As toddlers, they crawled on the cold floor, tracing patterns in the dirt. They learned to walk by clutching at the rough stone walls, steadying themselves with the hands of the other. They were twins not only by birth, but by survival, each the other's companion in a world where no one else existed. They learned to laugh softly because loud noises brought angry knocks on the boards above. The cellar was dim, lit only by a lantern their parents sometimes left. Their eyes, sensitive to light, adjusted to the gloom. They could see in shadows, but they could not see the sun. They knew nothing of its warmth except for the faint golden beams that sometimes slipped between cracks in the floorboards above. They would stretch out their hands, chasing those threads of light, whispering to each other about what might exist beyond. Hunger was a constant visitor. Their meals were scraps, sometimes stale bread, sometimes boiled vegetables left cold by the time they reached the cellar. They ate without complaint because complaint brought punishment, silence, days without a lantern, or worse, the angry voice of their father. Yet even in hunger they found small joys. They broke bread into shapes and imagined feasts, laughing as if their imagination could fill their bellies. As they grew older, curiosity began to stir. They found old newspapers tossed into the cellar, used for wrapping food or covering jars. Slowly, painstakingly, they traced the letters. One child would sound out a word, the other would repeat it. In this way, they taught themselves to read. Knowledge became their secret rebellion, their way of claiming something the cellar could not take. They discovered songs, too. At night, when the farmhouse above was quiet, they sang softly, hymns half remembered from the muffled sound of church bells outside. Their voices were gentle but sure, echoing in the stone room. Those songs carried them through the long winters, when the cold gnawed at their bones and hope seemed far away. But even as they clung to each other, the shadows left their mark. Their skin grew fragile, their bones thin from lack of sunlight. They stumbled often, their muscles weak from confinement. Their eyes hurt when exposed to the brief flare of a lantern flame. They were like flowers kept too long underground, alive but pale and fragile. Still, within the shadows they built a life. They invented games from the patterns of cracks in the walls, pretending they were maps of faraway lands. They told each other stories, tales of heroes who broke free from dungeons, of birds who flew over mountains, of children who found golden kingdoms above the clouds. These stories were more than entertainment. They were promises that life could be different. The cellar might have been designed to crush their spirit, but instead it tested it. And in that test, the children grew stronger in ways unseen. They developed patience, the ability to endure silence and wait for small mercies. They developed imagination, which turned dirt into castles and shadows into companions, and they developed resilience, a refusal to let their souls be as locked away as their bodies, but alongside resilience lived longing. They longed for the touch of grass, the sight of trees, the warmth of the sun on their faces. They listened to the muffled sounds of life above, the footsteps of neighbors, the barking of dogs, the ringing of church bells on Sunday mornings. Every sound was a reminder of the world denied to them. Perhaps the cruelest part of life in the shadows was not the hunger or the cold, but the knowledge that they were kept hidden not because of what they had done, but because of who they were. They were not thieves, not criminals, not sinners. They were children, different, yes, but innocent, and yet difference was enough to condemn them to darkness. Their parents' fear built the cellar walls higher than stone ever could. Fear of gossip, fear of rejection, fear of shame. In protecting themselves, the parents had imprisoned their children, and the neighbors who whispered suspicions but never asked questions had become silent accomplices. The twins' life in the shadows was not just a family's choice, it was society's failure. Yet even here a lesson emerges. Though they were denied sunlight, the twins created their own light. Though the world above ignored them, they found meaning in each other. Though prejudice cast them into shadows, hope kept their spirits alive. Their story shows us that even in the darkest places, the human spirit searches for light. Life in the shadows is not only the story of two children in Georgia, it is the story of all who are hidden, ignored, or judged for being different. It reminds us that shadows do not last forever, and that those who endure them carry wisdom and strength the world desperately needs. The cellar could steal their freedom, but it could not steal their will to dream, and that is why, even in darkness, their lives shone brighter than those who kept them there. In 1889, Georgia was still a land where tradition ruled stronger than reason. In the rural towns and scattered farmlands, people lived by the rhythms of the soil and the seasons, and they explained what they could not understand through old beliefs passed down for generations. In such a world, difference was rarely celebrated. Instead, it was feared. For the Johnson twins, born with albinism, this meant that their very existence became a mark of suspicion and shame. The truth is that their parents did not invent their cruelty in isolation. They were, in many ways, shaped and pressured by the society around them. Their choice to lock their children away was not only the result of their own fear, but also the heavy hand of the community's prejudice. Superstition in those days was thick as the summer heat. A child born with pale skin and white hair was not seen as a variation of nature but as a sign of bad luck. People whispered of curses, of spirits unsettled, of divine punishment for sins unspoken. Families who bore such children often became the subject of gossip. Some claimed their crops would fail, their animals would die, or that storms would punish the entire town. The Johnsons feared this more than anything. Poverty had already made them vulnerable. Their farms struggled, and their standing in the community was fragile. They could not afford the weight of suspicion, the whispers behind closed doors, the cold stares in church pews. And so, in their weakness, they chose to hide what made them different, turning against their own children to protect their name. This is the terrible power of prejudice. It twists love into fear, and it convinces people that cruelty is protection. The Johnsons loved their children in their hearts, but their love was poisoned by shame, and shame, fed by the gossip of neighbors and the judgment of society, became stronger than compassion. The community was not innocent in this. Though the townsfolk may not have known the full truth, they were not blind. They noticed that the Johnson children were never seen in the fields, never attended church, never played in the schoolyard. Whispers traveled through the market stalls and along the dirt roads. Something isn't right in that house, yet no one acted. No one knocked on the door and demanded answers. No one stood up to say that difference is not a curse. Prejudice is not only the cruel words spoken aloud, it is also the silence that allows cruelty to continue. The neighbors' unwillingness to confront the Johnsons was as much a prison for the children as the cellar walls themselves. What makes this story so haunting is that it could have been different. Had the society of that time been built on compassion rather than fear, the twins might have been accepted, even cherished. Their condition could have been understood as a rare genetic trait, not a curse. They could have attended school, sung in the church choir, and played in the fields like any other children. But ignorance robbed them of that life, and society's prejudice laid the chains. The weight of that prejudice fell heaviest on the children themselves. They grew up believing, at least in part, that they were the cause of their own suffering. They had overheard enough of their parents' anxious whispers to understand that their appearance was seen as wrong. Imagine the pain of being punished not for what you have done, but for who you are. That is the cruelty of prejudice. It convinces the innocent that they are guilty of simply existing, and yet even in this darkness the lesson is clear. The story of the Johnson twins forces us to see how society's fears can deform families and destroy lives. It teaches us that prejudice does not only hurt the victim, it corrupts everyone it touches. It turned the Johnson parents into jailers. It turned the neighbors into cowards, and it turned the entire community into a place where injustice could thrive unchallenged. But there is another side to this story. For when the truth finally came to light, when the twins were discovered by the traveling preacher who refused to ignore the whispers, the same community that had once been silent was shocked into awareness. The people realized too late that their silence had allowed suffering to continue. In their shame, they began to see the cost of their prejudice. The Johnson twins, though scarred, became symbols not of a curse, but of resilience. This transformation carries an important lesson for us today. Prejudice is not confined to the 1800s. It may not take the same form, but it lingers in different ways in how we treat those who look different, believe differently, or live outside what we consider normal. The question is whether we will repeat the silence of the Johnsons' neighbors, or whether we will have the courage to confront prejudice wherever we find it. The weight of society's prejudice is heavy, but it is not immovable. It can be lifted when enough people choose truth over superstition, compassion over judgment, courage over silence. The story of the Johnson twins should not only horrify us, it should inspire us. It shows that ignorance can destroy lives, but it also shows that awareness, once awakened, can change a community. Their story reminds us that every time we see someone being excluded, mocked, or judged for being different, we face a choice. We can add to the weight of prejudice, or we can help lift it. We can be silent bystanders, or we can be voices of compassion. And often, one courageous voice is enough to begin breaking centuries of ignorance. The Johnson twins carried the burden of society's prejudice for 20 years, but they survived. They remind us that no weight, however heavy, can fully crush the human spirit. And their survival challenges us to build a world where no child, no person, is ever again hidden away because of fear. For 20 long years, the Johnson twins had known only the shadows of the cellar. Their world was dim lanterns, whispers, and the steady rhythm of their own hearts echoing in silence. But every prison has a breaking point, and every secret, no matter how carefully guarded, eventually finds the light. The breaking point came not through the Johnsons' change of heart, but through a stranger's persistence. In the spring of 1889, a traveling preacher named Reverend Samuel Carter arrived in town. He was known across the Georgia countryside as a man of compassion, one who carried not only a Bible, but also a keen sense for injustice. Wherever he went, he listened more than he preached, and people found themselves confiding in him stories they had never told before. The Johnsons were not on his list of intended visits, but small towns have a way of whispering secrets to outsiders. In the market, Reverend Carter overheard two women speaking in hushed tones. "Strange, isn't it?" One said, "In 20 years, no one's seen the Johnson children." The other nodded. "Some say they were stillborn, others say." Her voice dropped lower. Others say they keep something hidden in that farmhouse. Carter's ears sharpened. He was not a man to dismiss such talk as idle gossip. He had traveled long enough to know that beneath every rumor lies a thread of truth. That evening, he made his way to the Johnson farm. Mr. Johnson greeted him stiffly at the door. "We've no need for preaching," he said, trying to dismiss the visitor. But Carter was gentle, patient. He asked about the farm, about the harvest, about the family. Mrs. Johnson stood behind her husband, her hands wringing her apron, her eyes avoiding the preacher's gaze. It was then that Carter heard it, a faint sound, almost like humming, rising from below the floorboards. It was so soft it could have been mistaken for the creak of the house settling, but to Carter's trained ears it was unmistakably human, a tune fragile and wavering, but a tune nonetheless. "What's that sound?" he asked quietly. Mr. Johnson stiffened. "Rats," he muttered, but Carter's eyes had already caught the flicker of fear in Mrs. Johnson's face. He knew then that something lay hidden. He did not press harshly, for harshness would close the door. Instead, he spoke of light, of truth, of how secrets rot the soul more surely than sin itself. His words were not accusations but invitations, to courage, to confession, to mercy. Hours passed, and still the Johnsons resisted. But Carter did not leave. He sat at their table calm as stone, speaking of God's love for every child, no matter how different. At last Mrs. Johnson broke. With trembling hands she led him to the cellar door. When Carter descended into that dark room, lantern in hand, the sight that met him stopped his breath. Two figures, pale and frail, huddled together in the corner. Their hair gleamed white in the dim light, their eyes wide with fear and wonder at the stranger who had entered their world. They were grown now, no longer children but not yet adults. Their bodies were thin, their skin almost translucent, their movements hesitant as though unused to space. Carter knelt, his lantern casting warmth into the shadows. "Children," he whispered, though he knew by their age the word no longer fit. But to him they were children none the less children who had been denied the right to live as such. The twins stared, uncertain. They had known only their parents and each other for 2 decades. The arrival of this kind-dyed man was like the sun itself breaking into their darkness. One of them reached out, slowly, hesitantly, as if afraid the figure before them might vanish. Carter took the hand, holding it firmly, gently. "You are not cursed," he said. "You are not a burden. You are children of God, and you deserve the light." Those words were the first gift of freedom. The discovery spread quickly through the town. Neighbors who had whispered suspicions for years were now forced to face the truth. Shock turned to outrage, outrage to guilt. People gathered at the farmhouse, demanding to see the twins, to understand how such cruelty had been possible in their midst. Some condemned the Johnsons harshly, calling them monsters. Others wept openly, ashamed that they had allowed rumors to linger without action. The truth was undeniable. The cellar had not been built by the Johnsons alone. It had been fortified by every silent neighbor, every fearful whisper, every unwillingness to ask hard questions. The twins, though free at last, were overwhelmed. The sunlight burned their skin, the open air blinded their eyes, the crowd frightened them. Yet beneath the struggle was a spark of something they had never felt before. Possibility. For the first time, the world above was no longer a dream whispered in the dark. It was real, tangible, within reach. The day of discovery was not merely about opening a cellar door. It was about opening the eyes of a community to its own failings. It was about breaking the chains of superstition and prejudice that had allowed 2 innocent lives to be wasted in shadows. And it was about the courage of one man who chose not to ignore the faint humming beneath the floor. From that day forward, the twins became more than victims. They became symbols. Their story traveled from Georgia to other towns, carried by newspapers and reformers who spoke against ignorance and fear. The Johnsons' shame became a lesson written into history. When society chooses silence, the innocent suffer. And yet the day of discovery was also a day of hope, for it proved that even after decades of darkness, truth can still break through, that even after years of silence, one voice can awaken a community. And that even when the weight of prejudice is heavy, it is never too late to lift it. The twins stepped into the sunlight that day trembling, their eyes watering, their bodies weak. but they stepped forward nonetheless. And with each hesitant step, they reminded the world of this truth: the light will always find a way in. Freedom, when it came to the Johnson twins, was not the joyful liberation many imagined. To the townsfolk, opening the cellar and pulling the pale, frail figures into the sunlight felt like a triumph, a breaking of chains. But for the twins themselves, freedom was disorienting, even painful. The very sunlight that symbolized life for others seared their delicate skin. Their eyes, long accustomed to the dim flicker of lanterns, watered and burned under the glare of day. The open air, the endless sky, the sheer vastness of the world, it was overwhelming, like being thrust into a storm without shelter. The first days were filled with confusion. Every sound was new: the crowing of roosters at dawn, the rustle of wind in the trees, the clamor of voices in the town square. After 20 years of muffled noises above floorboards, these sounds were almost unbearable. The townspeople, curious and guilt-ridden, crowded around, eager to see the twins, to touch them, to apologize through acts of kindness. But to the twins, the attention felt like another form of captivity. They had been hidden for so long, and now they were being displayed, their difference still at the center of every gaze. Physically, the struggle was immense. Their bodies, weakened by years of confinement, lacked strength. Simple walks left them exhausted. Their bones, starved of sunlight, were fragile, their muscles underdeveloped. The doctor who examined them shook his head in disbelief, remarking that it was a miracle they had survived at all. Learning to live outside the cellar was a daily battle. They stumbled often, frightened by unfamiliar objects. The sight of animals startled them. The vastness of open fields left them dizzy. Even food, when offered in abundance, overwhelmed them. Their stomachs, long used to scraps, could not handle sudden richness. Freedom came with its own kind of suffering, one that required patience, care, and resilience. Socially, too, freedom was complicated. While some townspeople showed compassion, others could not fully shed their prejudice. They whispered that the twins were strange, cursed, unnatural. Children stared and sometimes mocked. The very society that had once demanded their concealment now demanded their adjustment, expecting them to smile, to be grateful, to fit neatly into the world they had been denied. But despite these hardships, the twins did not give up. They had survived 20 years in darkness, and that survival had forged in them a quiet resilience. Slowly, they learned to adapt. The preacher who had discovered them, Reverend Carter, became their advocate and teacher. He shielded them from cruelty, encouraged their learning, and most importantly, reminded them daily that they were not cursed, but chosen, for endurance, for testimony, for hope. Education became their lifeline. They clung to books as if they were treasures. Reading came easier now, for they had already taught themselves from scraps in the cellar. Writing was slower, but they practiced tirelessly. Numbers, history, scripture, all became doors into worlds they had never seen. In their studies, they found purpose. They were no longer shadows. They were thinkers, learners, souls awakening to possibilities. Yet even as they embraced knowledge, their scars remained. At night, they dreamed of the cellar, the cold stone, the damp earth, the flickering lantern. Freedom could not erase memory. Sometimes they woke trembling, afraid that their new life was an illusion, that they would be dragged back into darkness. Trauma does not vanish with the opening of a door. It lingers, a shadow that must be faced again and again. The community, too, wrestled with its guilt. People brought gifts, food, clothing, blankets. They offered apologies in gestures, if not always in words. Yet, for the twins, forgiveness did not come easily. How could it? For 20 years, neighbors had passed by, whispering suspicions but never demanding truth. Their silence had been as binding as the cellar walls. The twins carried that knowledge heavily, even as they tried to move forward. Despite everything, they found strength in their bond. As they had survived together in the cellar, so too did they face freedom together. When one faltered, the other encouraged. When one despaired, the other reminded them of how far they had come. Their shared suffering had created a unity deeper than most could imagine. In time, they began to walk in the fields without fear, their pale skin shielded by wide-brimmed hats and long sleeves. They learned to face the townsfolk with steady gazes, no longer shrinking from stares. They even began to speak publicly, encouraged by Reverend Carter, sharing their story with other communities. It was not easy, every word reopened wounds, but they believed their suffering could serve a purpose. By telling the truth, they could help ensure that no other child would be locked away for being different. Their struggle was ongoing, but within it was freedom of another kind, the freedom to define themselves. They were no longer secrets, no longer hidden in shame. They were survivors, witnesses to the cruelty of ignorance and the strength of the human spirit. Freedom for the Johnson twins was never simple. It was a daily battle against fragile bodies, scarred minds, and lingering prejudice. But it was also a daily victory, a chance to choose life over fear, light over darkness, hope over despair. Their story reminds us that freedom is not the absence of struggle. It is the courage to struggle with purpose. The twins' journey teaches us that true freedom requires more than unlocking doors. It requires healing, acceptance, and the willingness of society to change. It calls us to recognize that liberation without compassion is incomplete, and it challenges us to ask, when those around us are struggling for freedom, will we stand as bystanders, or will we walk beside them in their fight? The Johnson twins, once prisoners of a cellar, became living proof that the human spirit can endure both captivity and the pains of liberation. Their struggle did not end with discovery, it began anew. But in that struggle, they found strength, dignity, and a voice that could no longer be silenced.